They teach you that silence is golden, that keeping quiet shows wisdom, that peace comes from not rocking the boat. They praise the silent ones, the ones who don't complain, the ones who accept what they're given without protest. But what they call peace is actually a graveyard, a place where truth goes to die, where justice is buried alive, where your authentic self suffocates under the weight of imposed quiet. Tonight, we shatter the lie that has kept millions trapped in comfortable cages. Silence isn't peace, it's suppression. In the grand theater of human control, no mechanism is more effective at maintaining unjust hierarchies than the systematic cultivation of silence among those who have every reason to speak. This is not the strategic silence of the wise who choose their words carefully and their battles intelligently. This is the imposed silence of the suppressed, who have been trained to mistake their voicelessness for virtue, their submission for serenity, their psychological imprisonment for spiritual enlightenment. Tonight we descend into the philosophical depths, where comfortable lies about harmony collide with uncomfortable truths about power. We will explore how silence functions as the primary tool through which the strong maintain dominance over the weak, how the absence of conflict often indicates the presence of oppression, and why those who preach the virtues of keeping quiet are usually those who benefit most from others remaining silent about injustice, dysfunction, and abuse. Through the ruthless political analysis of Niccolò Machiavelli, who understood that the silence of subjects often masks brewing rebellion rather than indicating genuine loyalty, through the shadow psychology of Carl Jung, who revealed that suppressed voices don't disappear but grow stronger in the unconscious until they explode with destructive force, through the authentic existence philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, who recognized that silence in the face of life's struggles represents not wisdom but cowardice, through the existential courage of Jean-Paul Sartre, who showed that authentic existence requires the voice to name reality rather than the silence that enables bad faith, and through the insights of those who have learned that genuine peace requires the resolution of conflict rather than its suppression, we will uncover why your silence serves others' power more than your own peace. By the end of this philosophical excavation, you will understand why quiet people are often the most troubled, why peaceful environments are frequently the most dysfunctional, and why learning to break destructive silence is not disruption, but the foundation of authentic harmony based on truth rather than suppression. The question that will determine whether you live as a voice of authenticity or remain a victim of imposed quiet is this: will you continue mistaking silence for peace while your truth dies in the graveyard of unspoken words? Or will you find the courage to speak the reality that others would prefer you suppress? Niccolò Machiavelli understood something that escapes most observers of human power. The prince who mistakes his subjects' silence for contentment will be surprised by rebellion, because silence often represents not acceptance but the strategic gathering of force by those who lack the current power to challenge authority openly, but possess the intelligence to prepare for future confrontation. Machiavelli observed that effective rulers distinguish between the silence of satisfaction and the silence of suppression, understanding that the latter creates dangerous pressure that will eventually explode with greater force than if grievances had been addressed when they first emerged. The wise prince encourages controlled expression of dissatisfaction to prevent uncontrolled explosions of rebellion. The political insight that Machiavelli provides is that imposed silence creates the illusion of stability while actually generating instability, because suppressed problems don't disappear, they compound, creating larger crises that become more difficult to manage than the original issues would have been if addressed directly through open communication and genuine resolution. Consider how this dynamic operates in practice. The workplace that maintains harmony by discouraging employee complaints doesn't eliminate workplace problems. It creates conditions where problems grow in secret until they manifest as high turnover, decreased productivity, or legal action that could have been prevented through early intervention prompted by honest feedback. The family that maintains peace by discouraging conflict doesn't eliminate family tensions. It creates conditions where tensions build until they explode in more destructive ways than if they had been addressed through open discussion when they were manageable rather than overwhelming. The relationship that maintains tranquility by avoiding difficult conversations doesn't eliminate relationship problems. It creates conditions where problems fester until they destroy the relationship entirely, rather than being resolved through the temporary discomfort of honest communication. Machiavelli understood that this suppressive approach to conflict serves the short-term interests of those in power who prefer the illusion of harmony to the work of actually creating harmony through the resolution of legitimate grievances and the establishment of fair systems that address underlying causes of dissatisfaction. The person in authority who discourages others from speaking about problems usually does so not because they want genuine peace, but because they want to avoid the effort, responsibility, and potential loss of power that would come from actually addressing the issues that create legitimate reasons for complaint. This approach transforms silence from a choice into a requirement, from a strategy into a prison, from peace into suppression that benefits those who impose it while harming those who must endure it. The silence becomes coercive rather than voluntary, serving power rather than wisdom. The Machiavellian principle reveals that genuine stability requires creating conditions where people can speak honestly about problems without facing retaliation, where grievances can be addressed before they become rebellions, where communication flows freely rather than being constrained by fear of consequences for telling truth to power. This principle extends beyond formal political authority to every relationship where power imbalances might tempt those in stronger positions to prefer others' silence to others' honesty, where maintaining comfortable illusions becomes more important than confronting uncomfortable realities that require effort and change to address properly. The strategic wisdom that Machiavelli provides is that encouraging authentic communication, even when it's initially uncomfortable or challenging to authority, creates more sustainable peace than suppressing communication until pressure builds to explosive levels that threaten the entire system, rather than just requiring adjustments to specific policies or behaviors. Carl Jung's exploration of the collective unconscious reveals the psychological mechanisms through which imposed silence creates what he called shadow accumulation, the building up of repressed psychological material that doesn't disappear when suppressed, but instead gains power in the unconscious until it eventually forces its way into conscious expression through symptoms, projections, or explosive outbursts that are far more destructive than the original material would have been if expressed constructively when it first emerged. Jung understood that individuals and groups who are forced into silence about their authentic experiences, needs, and perspectives don't simply accept this suppression quietly. They develop what he called complexes around their silenced material that operate autonomously in the unconscious, creating psychological and behavioral patterns that serve the suppressed content rather than the conscious personality. The person who is forced to remain silent about legitimate grievances doesn't lose their sense of injustice. They develop unconscious patterns of passive-aggressive behavior, self-sabotage, or indirect expression that may be more problematic than direct communication would have been. The silenced grievance becomes an autonomous complex that influences behavior without conscious awareness or control. The family member who must remain silent about dysfunction doesn't lose their awareness of the problems. They develop symptoms such as anxiety, depression, or behavioral acting out that express what cannot be spoken directly. The silence creates psychological fragmentation, where part of the personality knows the truth, while another part must pretend ignorance. The employee who must remain silent about workplace injustice doesn't lose their sense of fairness. They develop unconscious resistance patterns, such as decreased motivation, subtle non-compliance, or emotional withdrawal that expresses their suppressed dissatisfaction in ways that may harm their own career, while failing to address the underlying problems. Jung observed that this shadow accumulation creates what he called participation mystique, unconscious psychological fusion between the suppressed individual and the suppressing authority that makes both parties psychologically unhealthy, because neither can maintain clear boundaries or authentic self-expression. The person doing the suppressing becomes psychologically dependent on others' silence to maintain their own psychological equilibrium, while the person being suppressed becomes psychologically fragmented by the conflict between their authentic experience and their required silence about that experience. This dynamic creates what Jung would recognize as collective neurosis, where entire families, organizations, or communities become psychologically dysfunctional because they operate according to suppressive silence rather than authentic communication. The silence that was supposed to preserve harmony actually creates disharmony at deeper levels that may be less obvious but more pervasive and damaging. The Jungian approach to healing these dynamics requires what he called shadow integration, the systematic recognition and expression of suppressed material in constructive ways that allow for the development of authentic relationships based on truth rather than on the mutual participation in suppressive illusions. This integration process necessarily involves breaking the silence that has been maintained to avoid conflict, but it does so in ways that serve psychological health and authentic relationship, rather than simply creating chaos or destruction for its own sake. The goal is not to create conflict, but to resolve conflict that has been suppressed rather than addressed. Jung understood that this process requires courage from all parties involved because it involves giving up the comfortable illusions that suppressive silence provides in favor of the more challenging but more authentic process of dealing with reality as it actually exists, rather than as people wish it existed. The person who breaks destructive silence, from Jung's perspective, is not creating problems, but revealing problems that already exist, and providing opportunity for their resolution rather than their continued suppression into unconscious patterns that operate without awareness or control. Friedrich Nietzsche approached the critique of suppressive silence through his analysis of what he called slave morality, the value system that makes submission appear virtuous while making authentic self-expression appear selfish, that celebrates those who suffer in silence while condemning those who refuse to accept conditions that create unnecessary suffering. Nietzsche observed that slave morality operates by inverting natural values, making weakness appear strong and strength appear weak, making silence appear wise and speaking appear foolish, making acceptance appear noble and resistance appear base. This inversion serves to maintain power structures that benefit from others' suppression while making that suppression appear to be morally superior to authentic self-assertion. The person trapped in slave morality believes that remaining silent about injustice makes them a better person than those who speak out about it, that accepting dysfunction makes them more spiritual than those who insist on healthy boundaries, that enduring unnecessary suffering makes them more virtuous than those who refuse to tolerate preventable harm. This moral framework makes the suppressed person complicit in their own suppression by convincing them that their silence serves higher purposes than their voice would, that their submission demonstrates superior character than their assertion would, that their self-sacrifice proves greater love than their self-respect would. Nietzsche recognized this as a sophisticated form of psychological manipulation that turns people's own moral instincts against their authentic interests, making them proud of accepting conditions that diminish their humanity, while making them ashamed of asserting conditions that would enhance their development and well-being. The slave morality approach to silence transforms what should be a strategic choice about when to speak and when to remain quiet into a moral obligation to suppress authentic expression regardless of the consequences for personal development, relationship health, or social justice. Nietzsche's concept of master morality, in contrast, evaluates silence and speech based on their life-enhancing versus life-diminishing effects, rather than on their conformity to moral rules that may serve suppression rather than authentic flourishing. The master speaks when speaking serves life and remains silent when silence serves life, without allowing moral categories to override practical wisdom about what actually promotes human development. This approach requires what Nietzsche called beyond good and evil thinking, the ability to transcend conventional moral categories that may make suppression appear virtuous while making authentic expression appear selfish, that may make accommodation appear loving while making boundary setting appear cruel. The person who develops beyond good and evil understanding recognizes that sometimes speaking difficult truths is the most loving thing you can do for others, even when they prefer comforting lies, that sometimes refusing to accept dysfunction is the most helpful response to others' problems, even when they prefer enabling accommodation. Nietzsche's path requires what he called amor fati, love of fate, including the difficult fate of having to break silence that others prefer you maintain, having to speak truths that others would rather not hear, having to disrupt comfortable illusions that others use to avoid confronting problems that require effort to resolve. This love of fate includes accepting that breaking destructive silence will often result in criticism, rejection, or punishment from those who benefit from maintaining suppressive systems, but understanding that authentic existence requires accepting these costs rather than participating in collective self-deception that serves others' comfort at the expense of truth and authentic relationship. The Nietzschean insight reveals that the choice between speech and silence should be based on what serves authentic human flourishing, rather than on what maintains comfortable illusions, what promotes genuine strength, rather than what enables continued weakness, what creates conditions for authentic peace, rather than what maintains suppressive pseudo-peace. The practical implications of understanding silence as suppression rather than peace extend into every area where the absence of open conflict might mask the presence of unresolved problems, unexpressed needs, or systematic injustices that create suffering for those who lack the power or permission to address them directly. In family systems, recognizing suppressive silence means understanding that households where no one ever argues may be households where some members have been systematically silenced, rather than households where genuine harmony exists. The family peace that depends on certain topics never being discussed, certain behaviors never being challenged, or certain members never expressing dissatisfaction often represents suppression rather than resolution. This recognition allows you to distinguish between functional family communication that addresses problems constructively and dysfunctional family silence that enables problems to continue unchallenged. Healthy families have conflicts and resolve them. Unhealthy families avoid conflicts and suppress them. In workplace environments, suppressive silence often manifests as organizational cultures where employees learn that raising concerns leads to negative consequences, where feedback is discouraged rather than welcomed, where problems are denied rather than addressed, and where maintaining the appearance of harmony becomes more important than actually creating productive work environments. The organization that prides itself on having no employee complaints may actually have created conditions where employees have learned that complaining is futile or dangerous, rather than conditions where employees have no legitimate reasons for complaint. This false harmony creates environments where problems compound until they create crises that could have been prevented through early intervention. In intimate relationships, suppressive silence appears as partnerships where certain topics are forbidden, where one or both parties have learned to suppress authentic needs or concerns to avoid conflict, where peace depends on not discussing rather than on successfully resolving important issues that affect relationship quality and individual well-being. The relationship that maintains tranquility through avoidance rather than through resolution often develops what therapists recognize as emotional cutoff, psychological distance that prevents intimacy while maintaining the appearance of connection. Partners may coexist without actually relating authentically to each other. The development of healthy voice versus suppressive silence requires what could be called authentic expression skills, the ability to distinguish between destructive silence that serves others' comfort and constructive silence that serves strategic wisdom, between harmful suppression that enables dysfunction and helpful discretion that promotes genuine harmony. These skills involve learning to recognize when your silence is serving your authentic values versus when it's serving others' desire to avoid accountability, when your quiet supports genuine peace versus when it enables continued injustice, when your reserve reflects mature judgment versus when it reflects fear of consequences for speaking truth. Building authentic expression capability also requires developing what could be called strategic courage, The ability to speak difficult truths in ways that promote resolution rather than escalation, that address problems rather than attacking people, that serve constructive change rather than destructive venting. This strategic approach to breaking silence involves choosing appropriate timing, setting, and language for addressing suppressed issues in ways that maximize the likelihood of positive outcomes while minimizing unnecessary damage to relationships or systems that have value worth preserving through improvement rather than destruction. Perhaps most importantly, developing the ability to break suppressive silence requires accepting that others may prefer your continued silence to your authentic voice, may resist your attempts to address suppressed problems, and may attempt to punish you for disrupting comfortable illusions they have created to avoid dealing with reality that requires effort to change. These resistance patterns represent tests of your commitment to authentic existence versus your attachment to others' approval, your dedication to genuine harmony versus your preference for false peace, your willingness to accept responsibility for speaking truth versus your comfort with avoiding responsibility through continued silence. The ultimate recognition is that silence isn't peace. It's often the absence of peace disguised as harmony, the suppression of conflict disguised as resolution, the avoidance of problems disguised as their solution. Genuine peace requires the presence of justice rather than the absence of complaint, the resolution of problems rather than their suppression, the creation of conditions where authentic expression is safe rather than where silence is required. The person who learns to distinguish between strategic silence and suppressive silence develops the wisdom to remain quiet when silence serves authentic purposes, while finding the courage to speak when speaking serves authentic needs that have been systematically ignored or suppressed. This wisdom creates the foundation for relationships based on truth rather than illusion, for systems based on justice rather than suppression, for communities based on authentic harmony rather than imposed quiet that masks unresolved dysfunction. The choice that determines whether you live in genuine peace or suppressive silence is ultimately about courage. Will you continue participating in systems that require your voice to remain quiet about problems that affect you and others? Or will you find the strength to break silence that serves others' comfort more than truth, justice, or authentic relationship? Silence isn't peace when it enables injustice, when it protects dysfunction, when it prevents resolution of problems that create unnecessary suffering for those who lack power to address them directly. This silence is suppression disguised as harmony, avoidance disguised as wisdom, cowardice disguised as virtue. Your voice matters, not because it's always right, but because suppressing it serves systems that prefer comfort to truth, illusion to reality, false peace to authentic harmony that requires the courage to address problems rather than pretending they don't exist. Stop mistaking your silence for peace when it actually represents your participation in suppression that serves others' interests more than justice, truth, or authentic relationship. Start recognizing when your voice is needed to break silence that enables dysfunction to continue unchallenged. Break the silence that suppresses truth in favor of comfort, that enables injustice in favor of false harmony, that protects dysfunction in favor of convenient illusions. Find your voice not to create chaos, but to create conditions where authentic peace becomes possible through the resolution of problems rather than their suppression. Silence isn't peace, it's suppression. Break the suppression. Find your voice. Speak the truth that creates genuine peace through justice rather than false peace through avoidance. Your authentic voice is not the problem. The systems that require your silence to function are the problem. Stop protecting dysfunction through silence. Start promoting health through the courage to speak truth that serves life, rather than maintaining silence that serves suppression. The world needs voices that break destructive silence rather than voices that maintain suppressive quiet. Be a voice of authentic expression rather than a participant in collective suppression disguised as peace. Break the silence. Speak your truth. Create genuine peace through courage rather than false peace through suppression.